I'm Tom Backer, and I'm a psychologist. For the last more than 4 decades, I've had two major interests in my professional life. One is to help nonprofits become more functional and effective, and also to work with the funders that support them. The other is the psychology of creativity, to help arts organizations and artists have more creative impact. Those two interests have mobilized themselves into a particular focus on working with arts nonprofits. And that's a topic that has been through a lot of evolution in the last several decades here in the United States as well as in other countries of the world. Done a lot of research on the subject, worked a lot with individual artists on topics like stress management and career development, and for the last 11 years I've been running here at California State University, Northridge, Valley Nonprofit Resources, which is a service center for nonprofits here in the San Fernando Valley. According to the IRS, there are some 4,900 nonprofits in the San Fernando Valley region, and we strive to serve as many of those as we can. Some of them, not all of them, are arts organizations. So there are real differences between funding for the arts in the United States and in other countries of the world. In Europe, and this has become almost a cliche in talking about support for nonprofit arts organizations, in Europe, arts are funded a great deal more than here by the government. And so in most even small-sized European towns, particularly in countries like Germany, you have an opera house, you have some sort of a concert hall, and those are supported by ticket revenues, but also by public funding. The model is very different here in the United States, although there is some funding support for the arts that comes from government at the federal and state and local levels. It's not a very high percentage of the total funding that's needed to help arts organizations do their work. Individuals, corporations, foundations are the major sources of funding, along with ticket revenues and performance fees, admission fees for arts organizations of various stripes. So the funding mix is very different in the United States than it is in most other countries of the world, where public support is a much more major factor than it is here. Now, another difference that is more time-oriented is that government funding for the arts has become even more limited in the last few years, and now in 2017 there are gray clouds on the horizon that support may be dwindling even further. And one of the things that results in is more competitive pressure for the other sources of funding that remain, from individuals, from foundations, and from corporations. So new strategies are needed, particularly to deal with what is essentially the last somewhat untamed frontier for arts funding in the nonprofit sector in the United States, and that's individual giving at the higher level. The typical kind of level for that is $5,000 gifts or up. That major donors to the arts give individually in a different way than small donors, also important to the health and longevity of arts organizations, to get a lot of $25 and $50 and $100 donations. But at the higher level, a very different kind of strategy is necessary to have success in relationship building, in advancing an argument about why the support should come to one arts organization as opposed to another, or some other place that a wealthy donor might put their support. And here in the Los Angeles area, we also have a category, as is true in other big cities, of mega donors. People like Eli Broad and David Bennett and David Geffen give tens of millions, sometimes even hundreds of millions of dollars to the arts. And that's yet another level. The mega donor is a kind of exceptional case with a different set of strategies that are likely to work than the kinds of approaches that work with larger donors but not quite at that scale. But the basic principle is the same. It's all about relationships. Even in other areas of life, in the commercial sector, private business, and government, where obviously relationships are important, even more so in raising funds for nonprofit arts organizations to acquire resources from larger donors means that relationships have to be developed and have to be developed over a period of time. They can be developed by members of a board of directors or past members of boards, by volunteers, by other donors in some cases, seeking both general operating support for the organization and support for individual programs. Now, what does that mean? That means that arts organizations, nonprofits that do work in the performing and visual arts and in the various cultural fields, need to have an organized, usually in writing, individual giving plan that guides the strategy that they use to develop and maintain relationships and to seek and acquire funding from major donors to support their work. Valley Nonprofit Resources recently received a grant from the Amundsen Foundation to conduct a one-year project that is involved with working with a dozen of local arts and culture nonprofits on helping each one to develop an individual giving plan that can be integrated with other aspects of their development activities. The project that we're running starts with education. We're going to hold an event in a couple of months that will bring in the head of a foundation and a longtime arts consultant and former director of a major theater here in Los Angeles to talk about both their own personal experiences and what they've observed in the community about development strategies for working with high-end donors. Then we'll provide, out of that educational experience, individualized technical assistance to each of the organizations in our group to help them develop or to refine, if they've already got one, an individual giving plan. And the heart of this is that each organization is different, not only different in terms of what they do in their artistic work and what communities they serve, where they're located, what their size is and revenue and staff, but also what is their history of working with individual donors and what kinds of resources do they come to the table with of relationships that may already exist with board members, with other donors that they've had in the past or have in the present, and how they can mobilize those to serve the cause of fundraising through individual giving. So one size doesn't fit all is the bottom line here. And that's one of the basic wisdoms about individual giving that is often missed by not just arts organizations, but by nonprofits of all sorts who think that they can purchase a software program or take a seminar and that kind of out of a magic hat will develop an individual giving plan that can be based upon what other organizations have done. And that's usually not the case. For real success, it needs to be tailored to the particular dimensions of the organization, their context in the community, where they are in their life cycle. Are they a new organization? Are they a mature one? What kinds of track records do they have in giving that has been successful in the past? And what kinds of special resources might they bring to the table? For example, are there foundation funders that might be able to help them to seek individual donors? People of means tend to hang out with other people of means, whether the means belong to them personally or to the organization that they're involved with, like a foundation. And so having a connection made with a wealthy donor by staff of a foundation that supports an arts organization can make a big difference in terms of their success in establishing that relationship. But it always comes down to the reality, once the connection's made, of having superior services and programs to talk about, and the willingness to maintain and grow the relationship over time. Those connections might also be made through a banking relationship. Every nonprofit has a bank. Most of those banks, if they're of any size, have a private banking division. So, question that I'll often ask of nonprofit leaders who are thinking about how to expand their donor base is, have you talked to your relationship manager at your bank? In some cases, that might be your personal bank, the bank that the individual has, as well as the bank of their nonprofit. Have you talked with your relationship manager about introducing you to somebody in the private banking division of the bank that you do business with, so that things might happen not immediately, but maybe at the end of the year when a wealthy client of the private banking division is looking for a place to make a charitable contribution because their accountant has told them they have to give some money in order to move them into a different tax bracket. That connection might be made with the arts nonprofit that has been wise enough to establish a relationship so that the banker knows what it is that they do and can look for possibly a match between the donor who is their client and the nonprofit organization. In a world of much less certainty, fewer subscribers, that's been a major trend for performing arts organizations for a long time now. In some cases, visual arts organizations or other kinds of cultural institutions have fewer members than they had before. People are, in general, in American society, less willing to tie themselves down to any commitment that involves not only their money, but also their time. They'd rather have carte blanche to do what pleases them on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis. That in turn means that some of the most useful connections with potential donors are more difficult to come by because there are simply fewer names in the database that the organization has an ongoing relationship with. That means that there may need to be different kinds of strategies. It might be social media. It might be a crowdfunding approach for certain kinds of projects. Those sorts of non-traditional avenues for funding have become more important because some of the traditional ones have, if not entirely gone away, they have been reduced. So when you think about what kinds of strategies are most likely to work, relationship building and taking advantage of circumstances are perhaps the two most prominent strategies that can often be fused together into one. And I'll give an example of that. Francia Russell, the ballet dancer who with her husband Kent Stoll founded Pacific Northwest Ballet, which they led for over 30 years, told a story when I was working with them a few years ago as they made their leadership transition from the company up in Seattle, about something that started very innocuously in her neighborhood in downtown Seattle at 7 o'clock in the morning or so, walking her dog. And she encountered the same man frequently on those early morning walks, and they would exchange pleasantries and not really have a conversation until one day the dogs were sniffing each other and there was a pause, and they started talking a little bit about what they each did. The man was an entrepreneur. Francia was, as mentioned, ballet dancer, head of a company. The gentleman she talked with kind of took that in, and 5 minutes later they're on their way and encountered each other a few times again after that. And then another conversation took place, and he asked for her contact information. And a week or so later, a check showed up. It was a check for $100. And she was pleased by that and made sure that she thanked the man when she saw him the next time, and then gave him tidbits of information in the future dog walks where they encountered each other. This went on for a long time. No pressure, no approach, just the relationship that got built through the dogs having a relationship. And those two dogs that had the relationship led to something quite extraordinary happening, because about a year later, after the initial contact, another check showed up in the mail to Pacific Northwest Ballet. This time the check from the gentleman with the dog was for $1 million. And while that's an outlier story, the principle that it illustrates about continuity of relationship, about taking advantage of circumstances in the trade of development, it said that everybody who wants to seek resources for an arts organization has to have their elevator speech. Something short about the organization that says what it does and what kinds of benefit it provides to the community, because there was a communication from the leader of that arts organization up in Seattle to a potential donor, although she didn't know that at the time when the conversations began. That started a dialogue that went on for a long time, and I'm sure there were, in that same period of time, a year plus, that it took for that relationship to develop, there were hundreds of other interactions that Francia Russell had, which didn't lead to $1 million or even $100. But out of that strategy of taking advantage of circumstances, anytime that there's an ability to talk about the organization, to do so, and the development of a trusting relationship that not only is informative, but also is enthusiastic but not pressureful, so that somebody out walking their dog doesn't feel like they should turn in the opposite direction because someone is hectoring them for money every time they see them. That relationship building in the circumstances that were provided, that is a set of principles that can be used in a lot of different situations. Most of them probably won't, to be realistic, involve $1 million donation at the end, but often can lead to some kind of involvement, directly or indirectly, that can benefit the organization. One of the great truisms in the world of nonprofit arts is that if you took away the tax benefit of making a donation, people would stop giving. In research that's been done on this subject, and of course, because we still have the charitable donation here in the United States, there's really no way to know for sure whether the research that involves talking to people about what they would do if, is that research accurate in predicting people's behavior if at least deductions were reduced in scope. We don't know about that for sure, but what we hear in research on this subject is that it's not going to reduce near as much as some people fear the willingness to give, because people give for a lot of reasons besides tax deductions. That certainly is a factor, and there certainly are people who would give nothing if they didn't get a tax deduction for it. But other purposes also play into it. Having an investment in the community, wanting to have the social interaction. I'm on the board of a museum, and several of our recent additions to the board have said that their primary reason for becoming a board member was that they wanted to have the social connection with board members who have interests similar to theirs, and that they were willing to, in essence, pay for that, because there are board dues to be paid if you become a board member, and that was an important motivation for them. Now, that motivation isn't going to go away if their tax deduction for the board dues were to disappear or to be reduced. People also use the platform of particularly major arts organizations as a way of getting themselves into a higher social position. In many cases of doing business, there is a reason that corporations encourage their senior executives to become members of the boards of arts and culture institutions because they're interacting with people of means who often are running companies or otherwise involved in the worlds of commerce that can benefit the corporation that a board member represents. So there are a lot of reasons when you look at the number of Chinese who have come from China and have bought property here in Los Angeles in communities like San Marino. Now Arcadia is also a place where a lot of ethnic Chinese have purchased properties. They're here in part for economic reasons. They get involved in philanthropy if they pay American taxes, partly I'm sure for the deduction, but also because having that connection to the social world of arts and culture in Los Angeles can help them to become better integrated in a community that they might like to live in, at least part-time, and also can advance their business causes. So there really is a set of reasons that people give. Philanthropy tends to be driven by multiple motivations. And if you unpack those, you find that tax deductions always are a part of the scene, but they don't govern people's giving behavior as much as we used to think. Most nonprofits, and certainly most arts and culture organizations, begin as passion projects with one person or a small group of people who want to accomplish something in the cultural world and are dedicated to it. The passion often takes the form of putting in their own money initially to help create the organization, and often being willing to live in conditions of extreme poverty until the organization develops the resources to be able to pay them decently for their work. And those passionate individuals are not only very determined that they're going to fulfill their mission, but also very clever in figuring out ways to do that, to get their mission of service to the community fulfilled, even with pressure from funders to move in certain directions. Now, that doesn't mean that a funder can't influence the direction of any kind of nonprofit, and particularly of an arts organization. Sometimes a funder will make available funding for a particular population or a particular activity, and clever nonprofit leaders can figure out ways to make use of the funding that comes in that specific kind of funding package and still carry out their mission. However, there is such a thing as mission creep. That's a term that's been used for a long time in the nonprofit sector to represent the real problem of nonprofits that chase after funding and suddenly their mission is evolving in ways that they may not even recognize, much less want to have happen. And if that's the case, a board of directors can exert some influence over the leadership of an arts organization to hew to their mission, to keep the course relatively steady, but there's a price to be paid for that, because that does mean that certain resources that might be available to the organization won't come to them if they're not willing at least to make some compromises in their basic mission in order to attract funding support from funders that are very determined. If you look at the largest individual funders of the arts here in Los Angeles, people like Eli Broad are justly famous, some would even say notorious, for imposing their will and their specific direction on the causes that they support. And in one sense, it's their money, so they should be able to give it as they see fit. But in another, it can really wreak havoc with the purposes of an arts organization that suddenly is looking at a tantalizing prize of a large grant that will only come to them if they follow the dictates of the funder, whether it's an individual or an organization that is potentially going to give them some money. So it is a problem, but it's a problem that I think also draws in a positive way on the basic energy of arts organizations, and that's creativity. If you've got creative leaders who are very clever in figuring out how to satisfy a funder and also stick, for the most part, to their mission, that creative juice is a pretty powerful force, and I think in a lot of cases it can lead to success. But it is a problem, and it is part of the responsibility of a board of directors of an arts organization to look at what's happening in the seeking of funding, the development of programs, to see that the mission of the organization stays steady or is modified in a way that the leadership of the organization, both at the staff and board levels, is comfortable with. The organization might need to move. In some cases here in Los Angeles, with arts and other kinds of nonprofits, that's been necessary because community-based nonprofits have seen their populations change. Neighborhoods here in Los Angeles have changed from predominantly African American to predominantly Latino. What does that mean for the mission of the organization? Will it be able to survive? Will it be able to continue raising funds if it doesn't make some adjustment to reflect who's out there in the immediate community that they're supposed to be serving? And those are tough questions. I don't make any pretense that there are easy answers, but I think I will always bet on the creative force of the leadership of arts organizations, that they will have something innovative to bring to the table to try to solve those problems in a reasonably effective way. Along with individual giving strategies, one of the trends in resource development for arts and culture and for nonprofits of all sorts is crowdfunding. And those are Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and there are other websites that make available at a relatively affordable fee the internet-based technology that allows the creation of a campaign in which typically relatively small donations are made by individuals via the website to a particular cause or a particular program that an arts organization might want to seek funding for. And already in this relatively young field, there are some principles that have started to emerge for what works. Most organizations that have experimented with crowdfunding have had successes and also have had failures. They have had experiences with crowdfunding programs or projects where almost nothing got raised, and others that had unexpected successes and may have raised far more money than the original target amount that the organization was hoping to raise. What makes the difference? One of the principles that's come out of crowdfunding as it's been used by nonprofits up until now is that having an easy to define cause that you're trying to get funded, and typically having something concrete that will be the outcome. A particular set of performances if you're a performing arts organization, an exhibition if you're a museum or other visual arts organization, and having something that rewards those who have donated, even at the $5 or $10 level or $25 or $50, but modest donations. If you have something that you're offering in return, might be a t-shirt, might be VIP admission to a performance or an exhibition, something that the person who makes the donation will get in return for their donation. That, other things equal, tends to create a higher probability of success. In the end, it is in part, significant part, the idea, the quality of the creative project that sets apart those funding programs through crowdfunding that succeed from those that don't. But having an idea that you can get in a soundbite, having some kind of reward, having some way of knowing that you have been successful, and packaging that all in a way that comes from experience. Most organizations that try crowdfunding learn a lot from their first one or two experiences, and if it's a method of fundraising that's going to work for them. They learn how to do it, and in particular, how to say no to board members or staff or people out in the community who might suggest a particular effort be crowdfunded if it doesn't look like they're going to follow the principles for success, whatever they've been for the organization. And that's actually true for most fundraising approaches. There are a lot of different arrows in the quiver of fundraising. And one of the things that is most important for board members, for development directors, for artistic or executive directors to be able to do in order to manage the overall pattern of fundraising is to say no to things that don't fit the culture of the organization, that might have side effects that the organization doesn't want, unfavorable publicity or something of that sort, or that simply are not likely to work with that particular strategy. And maybe the idea can be retooled for another fundraising strategy that would be successful, or at least has a higher probability of success. Scale has certainly advanced remarkably in the arts and culture world in the last 10 to 20 years. It's advanced in the number of very high-end donors. We have far more billionaires in the world than we did 20 or 25 years ago who are able to give substantial amounts of money. We have a larger number of high-end donors in the billionaire class who, thanks to the efforts of people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, have made pledges to give away more of their fortunes in their lifetimes rather than waiting until after their deaths, which simply means that the funds are available earlier in time. So that scale has advanced, but particularly in the visual arts world, there's also been an advancement brought about by the red-hot market for visual art, for painting and sculptures by prominent artists, fetching prices that were unimaginable as little as 20 years ago, perhaps even 10 or 15 years ago. That's meant that for most of the museums in the world, for example, acquisitions without a major effort to mobilize the funds are simply out of the question for them, that they're not able to move in the high-end world of arts auctions, of paintings that perhaps the last time they traded went for $5 million and are now going for $50 million or more. That means that the economics are simply very different than what they were in the past. Now, clever leaders of arts organizations can help with that in several ways. One is by looking for emerging artists whose prices are not quite so high and betting that some of them will become more established and that the value of their works will increase, and also that will make good works available in the museum's collection. And also different kinds of fundraising strategies may be available to get not only cash donated by major donors to a museum or other cultural institution, but also in some cases donations of works that an individual collector may have been able to acquire, and then can get, amongst other things, a significant tax advantage by donating a much appreciated work to a museum of their choice. So there are ways that can be brooked, but it is an important problem for arts organizations, actually, of all sorts. It has a different face when dealing, say, with the performing arts. Their production costs have gone up of all sorts, everything from liability insurance related to live performances, to the cost of fabric for costumes, to the price of admission for performers to act in a piece. All of those costs have gone up at the same time as it is less likely that the organization will be able to rely upon a predictable source of income for their performances that comes through subscribers. It just increases the uncertainty of the economics and makes the chief financial officer of those organizations very nervous because there may be larger and larger financial commitments necessary to fund production, but less certainty about where the funds will come from. Particularly in the arts and culture world, there is a belief that lean and hungry is the best status for an organization to have, because that foments creativity. And a certain kind of creativity is encouraged by those living circumstances. On the other hand, in having worked with hundreds of arts organizations over a long period of time, I am often struck by the extent to which lean and hungry circumstances sap energy, require recovery from exhaustion just to keep the lights on, whether that's fundraising or making compromises, laying off staff when the budget is particularly tight, and so suddenly the artistic director is doing 3 other jobs at the same time. Those are conditions that are side effects, if you will, of the lean and hungry mentality and status of an organization that take away a lot of energy, and energy that often has to be invested in an uncontrollable fashion. Suddenly you're threatened with eviction from the space that you've rented because you can't raise the budget to pay the rent. And that means a loss of energy that can be devoted to thinking and planning for the future, as well as to carrying out programs and projects in the here and now. So one of the things that comes out of the industrial realm that has, I think, a lot of implications for arts organizations, and there are some that have experimented with this, is the idea of the skunk works, that within a successful organization you have a lean and hungry subset that's only lean and hungry in the sense that they're freed from the rules and bureaucratic concerns that govern the rest of a larger organization, and are given typically a relatively limited budget to work with, but one that's provided by the success of an organization at the larger level. And the skunk works is where experimenting goes on. And there are arts and culture organizations that have found that to be a successful way of developing, for example, theaters that have new playwrights programs, and that give relatively modest resources to those programs, but out of them may come a lot of works that are worthy but don't go on to great success. And then there's the public theater, which had Chorus Line, which has had other works that started at relatively modest levels and went on not only to become enormous artistic successes, but also to endow the organization with a lot of resources to be able to fulfill their public mission, which the Public Theater in New York gives free Shakespeare performances in the park, and those are possible because of royalties from Chorus Line and other productions that they've supported development of over the years. So having the ability to put into place a small part of the organization that's more experimental and by its nature is more lean and hungry can make a big difference in terms of keeping the creative lifeblood flowing, and in the end can have an impact on the long-term sustainability of the organization. A lot of it has to do with the vision of the arts organization that's supplied by its leadership at the top, artistic directors, executive directors, and board members who look at where the organization is going and at not one but a number of strategies that may be necessary in order to achieve the mission and to support that mission financially. Edison said the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas, and I think that applies vitally to arts organizations in their creative activities and also in their fundraising activities. I know it produces a knee-jerk reaction sometimes, particularly by artistic folks, when you mention fundraising and artistic in the same sentence. But I think both are driven by creative energy, and both are necessary for the organization to have a reason to survive. If you don't have artistic merit, why should you be around? But also you need to have financial merit, or you are very unlikely to be able to sustain the artistic excellence that you might have developed. So both are really necessary, and both are strongly driven by the same creative force. I'm Tom Backer, and I'm a psychologist. And for more than 4 decades, my work has been focused on 2 main interests: on how to make nonprofit organizations function more effectively, and on how to help artists and arts organizations maximize their creative impact. I was trained at UCLA both in clinical psychology and in organizational psychology, and those are 2 skill sets that are vital to the work that I've done since, both in the arts and with other kinds of nonprofit organizations. The organizational psychology is obvious, that good nonprofit organizations, first off, are good, well-functioning organizations, that they happen to be nonprofit and their tax status doesn't in any way exempt them from following the same basic principles of effective organizational life that all other kinds of organizations, schools, universities, businesses, also need to follow. The clinical psychology part of my background is important in a very different way, and it's one that is central to fundraising and particularly to the development of individual giving strategies with major donors. And that is psychology from the clinical standpoint, understanding individual people and their motivations and their social, emotional, and intellectual resources. That's part of what one learns as a clinician, and it's vital in the development of effective relationships. That's where fundraising, and particularly fundraising with higher-end individual donors, starts.